Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on U.S. foreign policy and global politics. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy, investment, and policy.
Thanks. Glad to be back. So we're recording this on February 19th, 2022.
Once again, in lieu of witty banter to open the show with, we hope to entertain you with our attempts to answer the latest news quiz on global events. The quiz is from Foreign Policies What in the World, published on February 18th, and covers the previous 7 days. Neither of us has seen the quiz or the answers.
That's right. And we actually were able to pass the quiz last week. So what's the over-under on us actually doing that again this week? I'm saying 40% maybe.
Yeah. I don't know. When I was printing it out, I just had to glance at the first question, not the answers. And it was like something I should know, but didn't. So it could be hard.
It's already off to a good start.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. So, which I really hate that I don't know this. Which Latin American leader traveled to Moscow to meet with Russian President Putin this week as Russia continues to threaten Ukraine? Brazilian President Bolsonaro, Mexican President Manuel Lopez Obrador, I don't know how to say anyone's name, Venezuelan President Maduro, or Salvadorian President?
Yeah, Nayib Bukele?
Yeah, we don't know, but...
Yeah, we're trying our best. I mean, I feel like Maduro is the obvious one to pick just because they're tied so closely to each other. I guess I'll go with the obvious one, Maduro.
All right, I'm going to go with, so part of me wants to say the Mexican president, sort of oil supply related. Another one wants me to say the Salvadorian president. But I think it was kind of unexpected who it was. I'm going to go with the Mexican president, actually.
Okay.
And we were wrong on every count because it was Brazilian President Bolsonaro.
I guess that's the other obvious one.
Obvious.
I felt like that would have made more news just because Bolsonaro is such a big personality. And
you
haven't seeing them together, right?
Heard as much news about him, but I think that's also probably because other things have focused, the news. And so just me not have gotten the same coverage. Because I don't remember any coverage of him going.
Yeah, I remember that at all. All right, let's go to question number 2. So fill in the blank. Last weekend, Ukrainian President Zelensky said, right now, the people's biggest enemy is blank. So is it Russia, NATO, panic, or Putin?
This one's an easy one, panic.
Yeah, panic.
Yay. Okay. This is another easy one. French President Emmanuel Macron announced Thursday that his country would withdraw troops from which African country? Benin?
Yeah, easy for you.
Oh, you don't know this one?
I don't think so.
Benin, Mali, Madagascar, or Senegal?
I'm going to say Benin.
It is going to be Mali.
At least you're on track. All right, question number 4. A ship carrying thousands of luxury vehicles was abandoned in the Atlantic Ocean this week after it caught fire. Which of the following brands was heavily represented on the vessel with over 1,000 cars aboard? Fiat, Mercedes-Benz, Jaguar, or Porsche? I missed that story. I'm going to say Mercedes.
Because I don't know either. I feel like we should broaden out. So I'm going to say Jaguar. It's Porsche.
Man.
I feel like that was like a 1 in 25% chance because whichever news service that was on was not one that we came across.
Yeah. Hey, is 3 out of 5 passing? I think we're up against it here. We're going to say 3 out of 5 is passing. All right. Okay. On Wednesday, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited the Israeli parliament, which is known as what? The Duma, the Knesset, the Bundestag, or the Majlis? I'm going to say the Knesset.
Yeah, me too. Yep, we were right.
All right.
So 3 out of 5.
Not too shabby. That's between two of us. Not too shabby. Well, actually, you got 3 out of 5 legit. So
I know, right?
I think you get the win. Get the win for sure this week.
Yay for me. Okay, so on today's episode, we will be covering the main news from February 5th to February 19th. We begin with the latest development in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, where war appears imminent. We consider how the West will respond and what the Ukrainian resistance might look like in that case. Then onto the Canadian Convoy protest and what it signals for the larger populist movement on the right in both the US and across the globe, particularly Europe. Finally, we wrap up by visiting the national elections in France and Hungary, where many of the same themes seen in North America are front and center.
So yeah, before we get started, I wanted to give you a shout out because you were actually a special guest on a kind of a new social network called the Clubhouse, where you were kind of the resident expert on Russia-China relations, and you held kind of a pretty extended Q&A sessions with people from around the world for about 2 hours on Super Bowl Sunday, which is quite the sacrifice, since that's nearly a religious holiday, I'm pretty sure, in the United States.
Yeah, and my Rams won, so that was
That's right, yeah, and then your LA Rams won, which is huge. But I was wondering, can you give a couple comments about that experience? Maybe first describe for our listeners just what is Clubhouse, and then what you thought about the whole experience.
Sure. So as we start with that, I want to give a shout out to the organizer, Peter, and we'll have his information in the links. And his club is called The Big Picture, and so he's trying to organize these specific events with experts on these topics, these sort of to simulate sort of what we're trying to on this podcast, but he's doing a different format, just having these discussions about these important issues in education. So Clubhouse is really hard to explain. And as I was telling Ryan, I've yet to hear anyone give me a good explanation. I heard the buzz about it in 2021 when it was like you had to know somebody in the tech industry. It was like really hard to get an invitation to. And so then I managed to get that and went on the app a couple of times and had no idea what to do. And then I left and I really hadn't thought about it again until Jacob Barlow, who also helped organize this, he's at Johns Hopkins SACE, mentioned that Peter was doing this, setting up this club and wanting to have these sort of talks. So Mashable described Clubhouse this way. It said, in short, Clubhouse is an audio-based social media app. The company describes itself as a new type of social product based on voice that allows people everywhere to talk, tell stories, develop ideas, deepen friendships, and meet interesting people around the world. Basically, you can jump in and out of different chats on different subjects, and akin to a live, free-flowing podcast. I include that description because everyone tells me it's sort of like a live podcast. So, and you're nodding your head. So I guess that's a good description.
Yeah, definitely kind of a live podcast. You have an audience that kind of already knows the subject and is interested in it. So I was really impressed, just with the quality of the questions, and it's an audience from around the world.
Many who were experts and had
exactly.
PhDs.
A lot of people had PhDs in the different subjects. So it was like everybody was adding their bit of expertise on China or the Ukraine. I mean, it was really good.
Yeah, so I loved it. I would love to do more of those, and we will try to publicize them as much as possible because, as I've envisioned this podcast from the beginning is this is our dinner table discussion with maybe a little bit more research that goes into our normal dinner discussions. And we want to include people as much as possible. And so it was great being able to interact. I learned a lot and just had a great time. And so hopefully, I know like a different app it's like another thing to learn, but it's not. You just have to download it. You can actually listen to the replay without having the app. So I hope you will check it out the next time we have something going on. And again, his club is called The Big Picture. All right, so you're looking to me. So I guess that means we want to go on to our first topic. All right, why don't you give us the main talking points, Ryan?
Okay. So, as we mentioned up front, we're recording this Saturday, February 19th. Obviously, this has been all over the news, so we'll hit the high points. But, it really seems like we're on the precipice of imminent invasion or conflict of some sort. That's certainly the message that's been communicated by the White House, especially towards the end of the week. And we've seen escalation on the front, particularly in the Donbass region. So just today, you've seen, a good amount of shelling from the Russia-backed separatists. I think I saw a headline with 2 Ukrainian soldiers that were killed already within this most recent escalation. In the meantime, you had a major security conference in Munich that was attended by Vice President Harris, who kind of laid out the far-reaching sanctions, which we'll go into some detail on. And it really seems like the opportunity for diplomacy seems to be running out, despite Putin, saying earlier in the week, and the markets actually responded quite favorably for a day or two. And it seemed like, maybe some Russian troops are pulling out of the Belarus following the military exercises. But it was obvious from satellite imagery that, in fact, additional troops were building up. And it seems like more and more that it's preparation for an invasion.
I feel like this has been like a really confusing, conflict. Or I just keep thinking about this because, one, I wanted Ryan to say that up front because I really think that if he's going to invade Ukraine, he will do it in the next couple of days. I think the Olympics officially end today. And I think that he is looking for at least within the next 5 days. I could be wrong, but I really get that feeling that if there's an invasion, this time it really is. I mean, I think the problem is like Biden administration has been saying it's imminent for like 2 weeks. And in fact, they backed up and then they've added back to it again. But I really feel like this will be the time. I feel like China thinks that too, because China is saying things such as like, you need to respect territorial integrity. They're not going as far on Russia as they did in 2008 when they were pretty harsh on Russia actually for doing that. But I think just the fact that they are coming out and like really emphasizing this territorial integrity again is sort of their worries too, that Putin will attack right after the Olympics, as has been his previous invasion. So there's been this really strange buildup. And I think whatever happens, we'll be asking for a long time about the strategy behind what Putin is doing here. So you can go on, but I just, this kind of going back and I'm like, who is Biden speaking to? Is he just telling Americans to prepare for this imminent attack? Or is he speaking to Putin? Is that trying to signal something to Putin? So I don't know. I mean, anyway, we can talk more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the whole technique and other people have discussed it in terms of the U.S. trying to telegraph, exactly what their intelligence and what they're getting fed as a way to subvert or influence kind of the plans. I mean, they've kept that up. And obviously the blowback against that is, oh, well, you're wrong. Why should we trust you on intelligence? This is just like Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. You guys are just feeding this and provoking this. I mean, that's the negative side of it. But the positive side, I guess, is it shapes the narrative for the international audience, because that's the other component of it, is both countries are trying to influence how will this be perceived. Russia wants to be perceived as, hey, they're committing genocide in this area. We're rescuing Russian citizens and our brothers in the Ukraine. Obviously you saw within the Duma this week we're on the process of passing legislation that recognizes the independence of these 2 provinces. And obviously, they've been trying to create the pretext for an invasion, through the shelling, there's just a lot of different things. But I think the U.S. has been good in countering all these scenarios, saying, hey, they're going to create a false flag. They're going to attack their own troops. They're going to attack their own separatist soldiers. Don't fall for this. I think in terms of shaping the narrative of how others perceive it, I think the U.S. has done a reasonably good job at that.
I think that's a good analysis of it. For me, I get this impression, less that the U.S. is wrong, but that it gives me the impression that Putin keeps changing his mind, or he's not completely decided on course of action. And then I was thinking today, well, how often has a conflict like this been, usually you expect like a leader to decide on a course of action and then take steps in order to carry that out. And it feels very much like Putin is still making the decisions every day on a daily basis.
I think he's reacting. I mean, I'd like to think what happened is that he underestimated the amount of cohesion amongst Western allies. and the response that Washington has given in terms of telegraphing these moves, telegraphing intelligence, moving, NATO soldiers up to the borders of the eastern nations. And that, this is kind of like a chess game, as kind of trope that is when you talk about Russian chess. But is it just he's being forced to, because of the way we're moving the pieces on the board, that he has to adjust over time?
Yeah, I just feel like at some point he should have made a decision about whether he's going to escalate, whether he just wanted Donbass, or whether he was going to go home. But he doesn't seem like he's had a complete conviction on any of those actions. Of course, this is just from the outside, so I don't know. But
yeah. But I think the one thing that did stand out, I know you've had the theory, and we've talked about before, that this is going to be limited to the Donbass region, which I'd say if you're making bets in Vegas, that's probably the odds-on favorite. But the fact that, as bad as this, I'm sure there are bets being made in Vegas. We're the UK on this, and people bet on everything.
I know. It's so weird.
This is weird. But the fact that Biden said, we have reason to believe Russian forces are planning an attack this week, and we believe that they will target the Ukraine's capital, Kiev. So I thought that was, that's kind of, because that would say, hey, they're going after the full.
Right, because the reaction, how the U.S. will react is certainly, my predictions of the reaction are totally different based on whether it's a full invasion, they go after Kiev, or they go with Donbass, right? And as I've stated here, I've stated Clubhouse, and I've stated to you very clearly, I think that there is not anything enough to deter Russia from taking Donbass, because the sanctions will essentially be the same that we took in 2014. And everybody, will kind of almost breathe a sigh of relief that it didn't go further with all these troops. But the calculation, the more aggressive Russia keeps taking this, is even with that, I think there's more and more pressure in general on to do something about Russia. And so, as I said to you before, they're not going to cancel Nord Stream 2. Those was put on hold for like a year. And then,
in the case of a limited, take Donbass, those two provinces.
Right? Yeah. But I think, more and more people are talking about this provocation in a larger sense. And if what kind of negotiated settlement could you get to this where you feel like you're actually going to change Russia's future behavior? And can't pretend that we can do that economically, but obviously you can't think of this in the short term. I think afterwards there'll have to be some really serious, thoughtful discussion on the security and decreasing Russia's, what it sees our gains from doing these sort of things, these actions.
Right. So I think that's probably a good segue to, because we mentioned, Harris is in Munich for a defense conference. Once again, mentioned the strong sanctions, but, we've never really discussed in detail, or we haven't discussed lately, kind of that list of sanctions and those specific activities. So I know you had looked up kind of what that list was. And I know you kind of backed off a little bit. I think even if it is just the two provinces, most of these sanctions go in effect, but maybe they don't last as long. But if it's a full-on, full-scale invasion and attacking of Kiev, this could be long-term sanctions that would be placed on Russia. You would agree with that?
Right. I think the very harshest economic measures will be placed on Russia. Europe will be forced to go a lot further than it wants to because of the backlash to their own economy. But unquestionably, the idea that Russia would take over another country like this, you don't want to allow that sort of precedence at all in the global community. So yes, I think there's only so much that you can economically punish Russia, but I do think there will be a much harsher line taken and for a much longer time. Mm-hmm. Because I think, there are some sanctions still on Russia from the 2014 invasion.
Right.
But, a lot of them, of the significance, over time just kind of drift away, and they definitely cost the European economy more. So about that list, I couldn't find a list. I told them, started this like, oh, we should give a list. And then I was like, so then I looked because I felt sure I'd be able to find one. I'm like, oh, no, there's not a list. I guess it's secret. I don't know. I just keep seeing like things, they've agreed to it. If you look this up, right, You see stories from the beginning of January through now with them constantly coming to agreements, the US and Europe and the Ukraine. But there's not an actual list. I mean, basically what we know is they will target the oligarchs and all their overseas properties, seize that. The one new thing that they will do is the technology, prevent the strategic military technology transfers to Russia.
Oh, yeah. Well, even more than that. I mean, they were talking about any US-made parts. So this would be like processors, so any component. It would basically cripple their tech industry if you're sanctioning every component of imports going in, if they're US-made or...
Well, one difficulty they will have for that came up in 2014 is we have military equipment that can only be made by the Russians. That's the only supplier of certain technology.
Certain components. Yeah, we'll have to look that up. So yeah, we'll spend a little time looking that up. I think the other component of it is kind of the U.S.-specific sanctions, which has been prepared by the Senate and is a list of specific items.
Did you see their failure to get agreement between Congress and the Senate?
Oh, the House and the Senate? No, I didn't. I'm sure if an invasion happens, they'll come to whatever compromise list. A lot of this, I know, is about the timing of it. I mean, they wanted to push for these to be implemented prior to an invasion as a means of deterrence.
Yes, I have to look more specifically at that bill because, again, it was when I was very last minute looking for a list of sanctions. But one thing I think that's also part of it is, of course, in the Senate, you want this harsh take against Russia, but I don't think you find the congressional support for it.
Okay. All right. So I think before we wrap up this topic, I think the last aspect that we wanted to cover was, in the case of a prolonged conflict, I think it's recognized by most defense analysts that the former Ukrainian military does not stand much of a chance in terms of its ability to resist a full Russian assault. So the best chance, and what's really been discussed, is the eventual insurgency. And you had a piece by Brian Pattis, a former military officer, the U.S., and wrote in the site War on the Rocks, talking about the Ukrainian insurgency and the ability for the country to carry this out successfully. So I think on the positive side, they mentioned, you do have a number of irregular troops that have been kind of formally incorporated into the actual defense plans of the Ukraine. In fact, they showed polling that was taken, I think, this past week, and 24% of Ukrainians plan to engage in armed resistance if attacked. Obviously, they've been under attack, and there's been a low-grade war going on for 7 years. So these are experienced irregular forces. They were originally funded by the oligarchs within the country, but are now kind of part of the National Defense Plan. Back in July of 2021, they provided a legal framework essentially for armed citizen resistance in the case of an invasion. So you actually have a kind of a legal basis to resist any sort of foreign invasion. I think the other component that he kind of mentions is, it's a combination of both kind of the armed guerrilla tactics where you have, kind of these enough special ops people armed with the things like the Javelin missiles, so the anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles that have been provided both by the UK and US allies, but then nonviolent resistance too. And if it's large scale enough, that really can affect the ability of Russia or Russian puppets, because I think that is Putin's preference still. And obviously that's another thing that's been kind of telegraphed by the Biden administration. But the way the Kremlin operates, the way they operated in Georgia, was to set up a friendly regime, to not have a huge troop occupation, because they know from Afghanistan, they know from our experience in Afghanistan and Iraq that, that can get pretty messy. So the nonviolent part can really, help form that. But the part that he mentioned, which I thought was good and I didn't realize, but there's actually no formal commitment to support any sort of resistance from Western nations. So it's really going to be a test upon that moment. I think, the outrage is going to be there. If they're shelling Kiev and thousands of people are dying, I would assume that NATO and European allies and the US would fund a resistance. But that's an open question, and because that's provocative. Would that lead to cyber attacks like we discussed a little bit, cyber attacks on the US and Europe? what would that look like? Because obviously it's going to be, they're not going to just sit there and let us fund, through Romania and other Eastern countries, a resistance.
Yeah, I think the danger is you get it in the game of chicken, which is what people have always said is the main danger if there is actual invasion by Russia. So what I've been pretty much focused on this week, reading about the topic, is the sort of overall strategic interest. The fact that you're going to have the United States and NATO, what are their actual strategic interests? And you can definitely say, let's forget natural resources, and you can say, okay, well, Ukraine doesn't have the Western strategic interest. Well, is there another interest to be involved in this conflict? And it's yes, of course, not wanting to set the precedents for a larger country to be able to just take over the territory of a smaller one. So I think that is what is still unclear, how I'll just say the Western alliance in general plans to address that. I think that's maybe part of the ongoing, or maybe they're just really hoping that they don't have to do that, because that obviously goes beyond, just economics. You have to find a way to increase the cost at all different angles, right? The only way you can deter conflict, right? The only way, and he goes into this in IR as well, why do large countries not just take over the territory of smaller countries around them all the time, like Iraq attempted with Kuwait? Why does this not happen? Well, two reasons. One is the cost of insurgency. How tolerant are you for long-term body bags coming back? And two, how will the international community, how will other countries react? I mean, there's a lot of analysis that Iraq president did not think that anyone would come to Kuwait to, defense. Oh, so then you get in this tactic. No one wants to go to full-scale war with Russia. Like, it's very dangerous. But there'll be this little game, though. Like, we can't allow you to do this. So maybe we do take measures to fund the separatists. And then how far are you willing to escalate? It's then Putin's like, well, we can't tolerate this, but we don't. There's nothing good for Russia to get into a major conflict with the West, right? But the danger of violence is always miscalculation. And that's the thing that makes this whole thing increasingly scary, is if it's a full-scale invasion, then there is the possibility for miscalculation.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole point of signaling things like this, sending, the javelins and, to make it that whole porcupine approach, the idea that anything beyond the Donbas region, which Russia effectively controls already, is going to be excruciatingly painful and isn't worth the cost. And that's probably why the odds are it'll stay that way. But the fact that, Biden in his comments is signaling that Kiev was part of these attacks, it's concerning that things are pointing towards, greater conflict.
Yeah. I mean, so that's when I will start to worry. If he attacks Kiev, then I think should be a very large cry of alarm or concern, even about the potential for escalation between the U.S. and Russia, because you cannot allow this to set beyond just Putin and Ukraine and Russia. You can't allow this to send a precedent from other countries. But also interesting how China will respond. So we've talked about the Chinese relationship with Russia. And if he goes anywhere beyond the Donbass, that may test that relationship as well.
Yeah, it might. I don't see them breaking because of that, but I think they'll be thrilled. And maybe the length of time that they're willing to provide financial support may be limited then, unless the Russians can wrap it up pretty quickly. So prolonged occupation, maybe Chinese patience wears thin after some time.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Other stories. Something we haven't really touched on, but it has been a pretty major, I say international story, but Canada is in this weird place for me. When I traveled there for 2020, I was totally thrown for some reason by the fact that it was treated literally like another country. People laugh. I had to go through customs like I would through any country. And I say this because my family is from Niagara Falls. And when I was a kid and I would visit them, you just went across the bridge to get to Canada. and they might look at your license. And like a lot of border communities, people based on exchange rate would shop on either side of the border. And my mind has a very hard time seeing it as this, the same level of international travel. Like I don't tell people, oh, the first foreign country I went to was Canada. I mean, it's true, but it's just kind of laughable. So anyway, but it is an international story.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, we're probably insulting our Canadian.
I know they are. I know they're
It is a separate country. It's not the 51st state, but yeah, some people look at it as 51st state.
People who live in Toronto will understand what I'm saying because they go back and forth on the border too. I mean, now it's different. That's a totally different situation.
Yeah, this is all pre 9/11.
Right.
I mean,
I'm talking about going there in the 90s.
Yeah, we're old, so.
Yeah, but that's what life was like in the 90s. It was a totally, totally different perspective. Yeah. What did you say?
That's so nice.
Our memories, I do think to some extent as we get older, like the 90s seem like this golden past in the way that they pretend.
It's like our 1950s.
Yeah, right.
Baby boomers look at the 1950s, we look at the 1990s.
Yeah.
This is the golden age. Everything's great. Everything wasn't great, but by comparison, I think objectively that people would say everything was great in the 90s. But anyway, just like the Russia-Ukraine, I mean, this has been covered in the news a lot, but just give a little background. So the Freedom Convoy protests, so these began about 2 weeks ago in Ottawa, and they were sparked by a mandate that requires the Canadian cross-border truckers to be vaccinated against COVID-19. And in general, like a lot of the protests going on, especially amongst the right, it represents kind of frustration around the pandemic-related policies. But at the same time, these policies have kept Canadian deaths at only a third of what the U.S. has experienced on a per capita basis. But it's also part of an older movement because you really have a lot of resentment. I work in the oil industry, so a lot of the Canadians near me are from Calgary. And this is a very different culture between kind of the Western provinces and Alberta and kind of that area versus kind of Toronto and Ottawa. So there's a lot of resentment there. A lot of the language is similar where it's this, these liberal elites ruling over us. But at the same time, this convoy, the fact that it was part of an older movement. We have a quote from Stephanie Carvin at University in Ottawa. And, it's really seen as an extremist movement at its heart. And nearly 60% of Canadians think of it consists mainly of anti-vaxxers and bigots intent on causing mayhem. That being said, it's gotten a lot of press in the U.S., particularly on the right. So I know Fox News has spent numerous hours of coverage on it. A number of these protest leaders have been interviewed by Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. And it's really being built up as a symbolic event of pushing back against a tyrannical federal government and its bogus COVID policies. So this one is really come to head over the last week, and a lot of it is driven by the economic impact on trade. So I think probably that second week of the protest, you saw the actual cutoff of the Ambassador Bridge. Actually, 25% of trade with the United States passes on that bridge. So for Canada, this was seen as a major blow. I know the Michigan governor called and complained about it because obviously, the auto manufacturers depend on kind of this relationship. And Canada is really concerned because it damages their reputation as a reliable supplier at the same time that the Biden administration is pushing for more U.S.-made auto parts, especially as they make this transition to electric vehicles. So this could not have come at a worse time for the Canadian government. So I think that's why you saw really aggressive act by Trudeau, where he invoked this emergency act actually on Valentine's Day. And this is the first time in its 34-year history. And essentially gives the government powers to override other laws, seize authority from the local governments, and freeze bank accounts of protesters.
I read, though, that it was mainly used in this sense to force the towing companies to tow the trucks.
Yeah,
they did not want to cooperate.
I think it's just it's invoking of that, and it's the ability. I'm not saying that the government's going to abuse it or use the full powers under it, but that's kind of what it signals to what's going to be used, by the right here as kind of a fear-mongering of, hey, look at what Trudeau just did.
But if there's
They're
gonna be
interested in
fear-mongering,
shutting us up.
we should
And
know what it actually did. And what it did is that they couldn't get cooperation from the towing companies.
that's how they used it. But their
Yes.
powers under this act are much more expansive than that. I think that's what even people that disagreed with the protest found this provocative in a way. I think the other provocative thing was the fact going through the Canadian Parliament was, a set of proposals that would actually criminalize racist speech. And, the U.S., it has probably the most expansionist view of First Amendment rights, of freedom of speech rights. But I guarantee you that the right within the U.S. will use the fact that this proposal exists. It hasn't been implemented in law yet, but the fact that it exists to lock up people who conduct any sort of racist speech.
How does this relate to the emergency power?
I think it's one of the other factors impacting the protest and why it's gotten so much traction. Yeah, it's not part of the Emergency Acts, but it's something going through their parliament right now and has gotten support as a way to limit hateful or racist speech, but actually criminalize it, which is real. I mean, obviously went past muster here, with the Supreme Court. But
hate speech is not criminalized. It's just
only under very narrow circumstances is it criminalized. But yeah, I mean, there's a reason why neo-Nazi groups and people exist at all, why the KKK exists at all, because that speech is protected. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that I agree with the Canadian stance, though more that they are talking, taking the relationship between this and violence. I think, it's not a perfectly black and white issue, and countries, different populations have the right to define that. It could be a slippery slope, but I think kind of goes beyond. That may be part of the protest, but I think it goes beyond really what this Freedom Convoy has been about.
Yes, I think the other interesting aspect about this is obviously the support that's gotten financially as well. So I think over nearly 50% of the funding for the convoy protest came directly from the U.S. A lot of people are seeing it as a way to juice up the base here in the United States. So I know they're planning a similar sort of protest. I think there's a couple different groups that are talking about driving from California to here in D.C. Obviously, having carried out this tactic, I think all the local governments and authorities have learned it's already illegal to block major public ways, but I think they'll be prepared for this. But it's definitely going to be used as a rallying point for the right heading into the U.S. midterms in the fall.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Europe too is prepared for similar tactics.
Yeah, because you saw it in France already. Well, not with the trucks, but in general around kind of COVID restrictions.
Yeah, but I was reading that they actually have groups planning this in France, but also Australia and New Zealand. And so all these governments are up to speed now on the tactics that they need to take to limit these. One thing though that is true is they were able to have so much of an influence, mostly because of this trade route, and it's kind of a very unique circumstances of being able to block one bridge and block so much trade transportation. I mean, that's what this really comes down to. This isn't like a tactic that just works anywhere. This is one bridge that is enormously important to trade. Just to know, automobile industry in North America is only really able to compete against Asia and Europe because basically NAFTA really streamlined the process of going across the borders of Canada and Mexico. So all three countries are really important to being able to make the finished products, cost, time, and technology and all of that. So when you talk about trade in general in North America, that's a huge component of it. But being unable to even break off substantial trade in these other countries, I think, makes it a little bit different.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing we didn't mention was that unlike the United States, the Canadian economy, 60% of it depends on trade. So when you shut off 25% of that with a single bridge, that's a huge part of the Canadian economy that you just shut down. So I'm surprised the government lasted this long. I mean, it's a major blow.
So I was reading too that it always seems like these are spontaneous protests, but this, looking at again, Telegram and things which are encrypted or partially encrypted. They've been planning this for 8 months.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just like January 6th. I mean, things were obvious on those message boards on Parler and Telegraph.
But I think the fact that the funding, the U.S. contributing of the funding, the thing that fascinates me the most about this is, well, one, anything has to do with trade and how important that is in, I don't know, a lot of different aspects. Like, that's still a crazy number. Also, just then, the 50% of your funding coming from the United States is kind of crazy. And it seems like what we used to see in the past about far-right movements, which we talked about it mostly in Europe, is you certainly did not have a lot of funding coming into them from elsewhere, right? You didn't have a lot of international funding going into the French.
Yeah, no, not on the right. I'd say the only case where you saw that was with the IRA. And the United States and Irish Americans funded a good amount of that, probably 50% of that, which are basically a terrorist group.
Yeah.
Which I always find really crazy, looking back on. But
yeah, I think it becomes really notable for that and how this ties into. So I was thinking, because we had tried to cover, but we ran out of time, the American far right fascination with Hungary and importing that model. And so it just made me think of the way that the far right is internationalizing almost its movement in a way that, yes, you've seen with far left groups, but you've not seen on the far right, especially since that's usually a more nationalistic. So I think people have to keep coming up with new ideas. Like the truck convoy, it's not, you can call it or make it that, but you're not going to have the next really impactful thing is going to be some other crazy thing they managed to plan. I don't know. I think this is the interest to me, the concern to me. Obviously, the far right now certainly has more power than any leftist socialist group in my lifetime.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one true socialist group doesn't exist in the United States. I mean, I don't know all the different parties. Although, from what I read, Canada basically is a two-party system as well. They have other kind of minor third parties. But so I would say on the North American continent, well, excluding Mexico, you don't have a real socialist government for sure.
And we haven't. So for me, this harkens back, to times that we haven't had living experience of. And a lot of more political economists that I've been reading are looking more at the kind of the instability that happened before World War I with these different groups. I mean, at the time, it was both, leftist and far right, but it certainly is concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, that's a good transition point, I think, for our last topic of discussion, where we look at 2 European elections, both in France and Hungary, that are coming here in April. So I'll throw it to you, Anita, for discussion around the French election.
So we have these upcoming French elections where Macron certainly looks favored, but the far right has definitely had a powerful movement in France for a long time. So you have, in general, in the elections, he has a center-right candidate, Valérie Pécresse, and then you have Marine Le Pen, who is a nationalist Eurosceptic, and then you have Eric Zemmour, who is very anti-immigration and actually uses language that's much more similar to Le Pen's father, that used as sort of one of the leaders of the far right in Europe in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the shocking thing is you have Marie Le Pen, who famously kicked out her father from the party that he started, being outflanked on the right by Zemmour, who's really kind of risen. He's had no political career prior to this. He wrote an op-ed piece for a right-wing newspaper in France and also appeared on kind of their 24-hour, I assume, like Fox News, as a commentator. So he's had more of a public, intellectual, firebrand sort of guy. So naturally, he's attracted the attention of Trump and other people kind of sympathetic towards that approach.
So the French election system has to be explained here because it's really different than the US's. And basically that there are 2 elections, 2 stages, and everyone votes twice. You have to vote in both stages. So in a lot of countries, you have many candidates, you might have like runoffs. If nobody gets above 50%, then the top so many candidates run against each other. But in France, you always have a second election. So the first election is this wide-ranging number of candidates. And people vote not necessarily for who they want to become president. So a lot of people use this time as a protest vote or to vote for candidates that there was a story, I can't remember, maybe on The Economist, and it was saying like, talk to people who, said he was going to vote for this far leftist policy. And it was asked, well, who will you vote for in the general election? And it was like Macron. It's a really unique, or at least odd to an American system to understand. So basically, the thing about the right, which also is maintained 30% of support. So it hasn't actually grown in support. It's just the strong vocal 30%, which sounds very familiar because that is the numbers they consist of the United States. Of course, we have a very interesting representative system, which allows them to have more power as if they were more than 50%. But it's the same number. So this might reflect like a more trend or sort of societal basis where you're going to have this level of support. But so it is sort of among these, far right challengers, how will that affect elections and which one of these will actually face Macron? So in the second round of elections, it's the two most
leading vote getters in those runoffs. Yeah, no, for sure. No, I mean, I think the story here is really, one, it's the cannibalization of the right. So you have three individuals kind of fighting and splitting the vote, and just this rise out of nowhere of Zemmour, and the fact that it is very reactionary sort of language. I mean, his main themes, which will be familiar, one is this lament for the collapse of authority and identity and virility and traditional families in the face of feminism, consumer society, liberalism, gender indecision, and other imported American ills. So blaming the U.S. for corruption within society. And then, of course, the other component, which is a common theme and mandatory for the right, is the Islamization of French society. And basically, he goes on about the reverse conquest and uses, what frankly is a white supremacist theory of the Great Replacement, that what is a small minority, because keep in mind that France is 85% white, is going to be repopulated by Islamic society and conquered that way.
Yeah, that whole theory, because their devious plan to have lots of children to replace. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And between that and the immigration policy, this is what's going to turn France into a third world hellhole.
I mean, they're all pretty anti-immigration.
Yeah, they have to be, but as a common
more hateful speech, really, I think.
Yeah. And also, pushing it up to anti-Semitic, and this is the fact: the guy's Jewish. But despite being Jewish, one of his positions is he actually defends Vichy France, so the collaborationist with Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm.
His excuse for it was like, well, Vichy France protected the French Jews because it deported the foreign Jews first to Auschwitz, so it's okay. Vichy France is legit. They weren't that anti-Semitic. I'm like, okay. So, pretty crazy rhetoric. Obviously, you've seen it before in Le Pen. And the other aspect of it is because they're cannibalizing, because they're beating each other up, every single outcome, because The Economist has been modeling this, Macron's almost a shoo-in. I think they have him at like 85% chance of winning in April, which is good news for the EU and for the pro-classic liberalism. And
so what's interesting, though, too, right, is one, the way they model data for the French election, they use 100% polling data because they said that's the only thing. So unlike American elections, which use variety, that polling is the only thing that has been positively correlated with knowing who the winner is going to be.
Yeah, they have a good track record, their methodology in The Economist, yeah.
Two, though, what I found fascinating is there's not really a campaign season yet. There is no political campaigning right now in France for the presidential elections. So there's this site that I guess they've now kind of expanded to a whole bunch of countries. I mean, I'm not saying it originated in France, but it's the type of site we always used when we were living abroad, where it's like, French news to people living in France in English, right? So basically expatriates and stuff like that. And so they're doing a coverage on doing a podcast. So the site actually is behind a paywall, which is kind of annoying. I was just searching through my podcast and came across it. And so they're covering the French elections with their political reporters. It's actually very informative, but it's like they're basically, well, there's only so much we can say on the elections because no one is campaigning for them yet. And I thought, wow, that is just...
Yeah, but isn't that everywhere except here?
I know.
Is but what, elections don't have to last a year and a half? What's going on?
But not even that, though. I mean, we're not that far away from April.
Yeah, keep it tight. God, I wish it was like that here. Jeez, that would be...
The other kind of interesting thing that is Macron refuses to say he's going to run.
Oh, yeah, he hasn't even officially announced, which is crazy. Yeah.
But, the reporters, it's like he's going to run. I don't know what the strategy is necessarily in refusing to commit to, but it's a very different system, as one might imagine. But so even as you're talking about Zemmour, the French have this interesting intellectual history, right? Where I think, completely speak to it, but are more engaged with it. Like a non-Parisian still might be more engaged or might be more familiar with that sort of intellectual tradition. And obviously because the far right is appealing to those people too, right? I mean, they're sometimes misusing these French intellectual elites from the past to say these crazy anti-Semitic.
And I think that, and maybe that's what you're getting at, but yeah, I was reading with Zemmour in terms of who he's targeting, because Le Pen always targeted the blue collar, more in kind of the rural areas of France, but he's targeting kind of the upper middle class, the elite, the business owners within the cities, kind of with his approach. Yeah.
Which, despite us not ever speaking like that's what Trump does, I mean, that's what Trump does, right? I mean, his supporters are not necessarily the working class. I mean, they are, but they're the upper working class. They're not like the poor working class. I mean, so people who are earning less than $100,000 were much more likely to vote Democrat than they were to vote Republican for Trump.
Yeah.
But as we saw on January 6th, what Trump does is he does get, though, these business owners and people over 100,000 living in these communities who feel oppressed culturally in some ways too. So I think Zemmour is taking a kind of tactical similarity.
Why they connected between kind of the television star sort of connection. But yeah, I mean, so Trump fielded a call with Zemmour, and essentially he just had a conversation giving him advice. I don't know if he came out and endorsed Zemmour like he did with Orban and some of these other, with Bolsonaro, but it was more or less seen as an endorsement and a major snub to Le Pen. So I think Le Pen, that's been the most interesting to see her completely collapse, because this guy's come out of nowhere and gotten the Trump blessing, which I guess in the right wing of France that counts for a lot.
So even as I was listening to this, I listened to both the local podcast on French elections and The Economist covering the French elections, and again, both sides were like, well, we can't say a lot because there hasn't actually been campaigning. There's this 30% that are far right that it's the same group of people largely, although Zemmour is targeting southern France, where you have the traditional far right, where Le Pen's constituency has always been in the more northern parts of France. Is the language, right? And just, in this way too, very much internationalization of the far right with money, but also in the language, right, that they speak. And I think they're going to language that before political leaders tried not to say so directly, even in the far right, because you want to be racist signals without maybe the direct racist hate speech that they're increasingly going closer to the line with.
I mean, yeah, the whole great replacement theory, that is strictly out of white nationalist ideology and was never spoken. But, you saw Tucker Carlson basically made it mainstream. So now it's felt safe, I think, throughout the Western world for right-wing politicians to talk about replacement theory.
Yeah. So I think you're seeing this kind of troubling trend in collaborating in different ways and finding tactics that work in different places. I mean, though also interesting because the French also have a lot of enemies, anything that's seen as an American import. So it's kind of funny that, even as he's saying like all these bad things are an American import, because like that French love that, right? They love saying anything they don't like is an American import. But he's also then importing language that's used more by the far right in America than has traditionally been used in France.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I mean, it's a little bit of a circular thing because when this language, obviously a lot of this language, originates within Europe, within the fascist period. But yeah, now it's more of a circular thing where we're going back and influencing them, kind of like with beer. I mean, the fact that, we're now became better at beer brewing. So now you're seeing IPAs like in Germany and things like that. So now it's more of a circular
well, I mean, they're all owned now by European. So like all the European companies bought all the American beer companies.
Yeah, the bigger ones, but not all the IPA and independents. And there's still a lot of independent small brewers out there. But yeah, definitely with all your big, what used to be like, Blue Moon and all that sort of stuff is like owned by InBev. But nevertheless, not to get stuck on the beer analogy.
Right, because that was... So it's definitely one aspect of this, and we may see a lot more focus on this once they actually begin their campaign season. I think the influence, Hungary kind of is definitely different, but you wanted to mention the elections.
Yeah, I would just be real quickly, just because Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party, which he is head of, have been so enormously influential on the right, both within Europe and then increasingly here in the United States. We wanted to mention kind of their election. So that election is coming up on April 3rd. And obviously, since Orban came to power 12 years ago, he's been real busy on disassembling kind of a free and fair election system. And this has really been seen as a model for how a minority can rule over in a country. And I think probably the interest from some actors on the right, both within Europe and the United States. But essentially, Hungary's been able, and Fidesz, the governing party, has translated just over half of the popular vote that they've gotten into a 2/3 majority in parliament. So they have a supermajority. They've used that in order to change the constitution, pack the courts, and actually use EU aid to direct to their allies. So again, this kind of comes up the conversation of, is the EU actively considering Hungary's membership, given some of these actions? But, the opposition parties are, unlike what you're seeing in France with the right, they've coalesced into a single group. These are parliamentary style elections. I guess they're all kind of represented on a single ticket. But that being said, the Fidesz party still has a huge advantage. And a lot of it comes from who they've granted voting rights to. So they actually granted voting rights to ethnic Hungarian minorities in neighboring countries. So they're citizens of another country, but they're allowed to vote in Hungarian elections, which heavily favors the Fidesz party. Meanwhile, Hungarians who essentially are living as expats, they tend to be highly educated and would vote against the party. In order for them to vote, they actually have to go to the consulates abroad. And who knows how accessible those are being managed.
So the irony of not even necessarily the far right, really it's become mainstream right in many respects in the US, is how they like to talk about Venezuela as this failure of socialism, way more complicated than that. But this is Chavez's playbook, right? Venezuela had been a democracy for 100 and so years, right? The shock of it becoming an authoritarian country, it was one of the oldest democracies in the world, right? After the United States. And so everyone knew new democracies were susceptible of falling back. But this also reminds me that a lot of people don't necessarily classify in political. I always am reading, Maduro's making it more authoritarian, or, they're trending toward authoritarian. Or if you look at how it's coded, it's still coded as a weak democracy. And I think that's what you see the problems in Hungary is what extent. So Chavez did the same. He got his supermajority. He packed the courts, which was extremely important, and changed the constitution. in ways that made it very difficult for any opposition to run against him. That's exactly what he did.
But I think, what's interesting is Orban's doing this in the framework as an EU member. So
right.
if Hungary were to apply today for EU membership, they'd be rejected for sure, based on these standards.
But this is how you destroy democracy. I mean, this is exactly what's happened before. And we still call Hungary a democracy because of on paper, but they still some people still call Venezuela a democracy because on paper. And, shutting down the media, not having a free press is something you talked to me about, a measure that he's done. In Venezuela, the, strikes, the whole reason why there was this big business strike in Venezuela was because changes to the constitution. It's so very eerily similar to me. Obviously, I did not read the details of this until right now, but having studied very much Venezuela's transition from a democracy to its current period, this is how you do it. You have a fairly elected leader who then takes these sort of...
Yeah, and of course the disturbing part, I mean, similar to the far left with Venezuela for that brief period, I think when commodity prices are high and before it became real abusive, Venezuela and the Bolivarian, revolution was held up as a model for a new leftist government, new socialist government. So you see the same thing with the far right, which is much larger portion of the population in the US and in Europe, but being held up as a model to the point where the US one of the major conservative conferences, CPAC, is going to be held in Hungary.
And I think really notably where the difference is and why Venezuela was not a good model for anything is that it was a petrostate. And so its economy was completely unique. But the actual actions Chavez took to become a dictator, essentially this playbook.
Oh, yeah.
Not that people who want to look at the very technical elements of democracy would never say that he was a dictator or Maduro's a dictator, but that's in essence. But also in the way that you had then the opposition parties coalesce against an opposition, but just when everything's in place, to keep from having... Chavez also gave Colombians in Venezuela the right to vote before he made them national citizens,
similar
because they would support him.
Yeah. So again, disturbing to see one of our major political parties throw up Hungary as a model in which to emulate.
So that's the thing. It's one thing Tucker Carlson going there and saying all these great things about the model, but that they are having a national political conference in a foreign country boggles my mind. I just don't understand. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's fascinating, but my head cannot get wrapped around it.
Yeah.
So it's the conservative CPAC, conservative
political action committee, I think. Yeah.
Which used to be less important, but is more important because it's like Trump's wing of the party. I mean,
the party is what you're saying.
So it used to be just these extremists in the party, and you didn't have to worry too much about what was being said at CPAC because it wasn't.
Well, I mean, CPAC used to be a little broad, and that was actually, back when the intellectual tradition existed, and like the Heritage Foundation actually put forth decent policy papers back in the Reagan period. I mean, it was seen as just the standard gathering and a place to, the William F. Buckley sort of, element of the party. But yeah, I'd say the last 15 years, it's just deteriorated into kind of the circus it is today.
And there's a lot you could really get into about these ties with Hungary, Orban, that go way back for the current era, and these connections that go deep before, even during the period where Orban lost power, which he completely attributed to the United States. It was during the George W. Bush administration, where they did push back a lot on any of these non-democratic techniques. So a lot of change and kind of interesting, disturbing, but also I feel like when I say something significant, sometimes hard to, basically it means something we need to understand and pay attention to, I think. We're not coming to any conclusions. There aren't conclusions, but sort of how this interacts, influences. No matter what people tell you, the era of globalization is not over. And, despite protests over trade continues to grow, but so does the exchange of these movements, which a lot of people have always said is maybe the downside of more interaction. Right. So I think that's
the episode.
Thank you, everybody, so much who's listening to us. If you enjoy it, please share it with people. Help us get the word out. Interact with us, Facebook, Twitter. If you have questions you want us to cover, not only will we try, but we're going to have some interviews upcoming, so we can try to find people that are experts that can speak to it more informatively than we can. So please leave a review if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or somewhere else where you get podcasts, because that will really help people find our show. And so you can visit our website, www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com, and follow us on Twitter, or me really right now, AR Kellogg.
Okay. Yeah. And you can reach us by email again with all those ideas for topics, or if you want to make a guest appearance. So you can reach Anita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. And then, as Anita mentioned, see the show notes for the articles that we talked about. And please leave a review and rating with your favorite podcast provider.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.